Good afternoon. My real name is not whatever that says. We'll go with Chef for today. Thank you for coming. It's awesome to be here. Thanks also. So everyone that's affiliated with DEF CON, this is phenomenal. Thank you for all the hard work you do. The goons, you guys are doing a great job. This is fantastic, if not overwhelming. And so after you get the letter that says, hey, you've been accepted, and the excitement wears off, you think, oh my God, I've been accepted. I hope someone will show up and watch this thing. So thank you for you guys for coming and standing in the line and coming into the room. Uh-oh. I'm going to keep going. What I'm here to talk about today is the Beyond the Scan, the Value Proposition of Vulnerability Assessment. Great title, right? It's not a tools talk, though. So first of all, I poll the room. How many folks are involved in vulnerability assessment or vulnerability management of some type? Great. You're the people I want to talk to. So we already know how to do the scan.
I'm sorry, it's not a tools talk. Your talk's been canceled.
All right, well, see ya. Do I still get...
We have a little tradition here at DEF CON. When you're a
Thank you.
first-time speaker, you must do a shot on stage.
Excellent.
So, oh, wait a second. I got those mixed up. That one's yours. All right. I do this all day.
I know,
all
yeah.
Right. DEF CON, our brand new speaker.
DEF CON 23. Thank you very much.
Good luck.
Thank you. Water chaser. So a lot of us already do vulnerability assessment. We're involved in scanning types of activities, so we kind of know how that works. We're doing that already in our organizations. But I think there's a lot of the aspects of performing scanning that are not well understood. Maybe not by us, but perhaps by our organizations. And I think when I started working on this presentation, I was a client and several clients that I've worked with over the years that knew that they needed to do this, but they weren't necessarily altogether clear on what we would do with that information once we got it. And so in working with clients and going through that narrative on what we're doing while we're performing the scans, I realized that there's an opportunity maybe to help us as performing this activity to really make more meaningful changes with our organizations. And you'll hear me say this a couple of times, kind of where the layer 8 happens, as we get further away from the technical activity and we're actually trying to impact the business and make meaningful change. I'm going to talk a lot about, too, as us, the human beings that are doing the scans and also trying to communicate with the business that we support. So that's what we're talking about. This is me, managing consultant at IOActive, from Louisiana. Like we say in Texas, I'm not from Texas, but I got there as fast as I could. IT since 1995, and I started focusing on InfoSec in 2001. So I love, like all of you, I love this industry. I like the dynamic nature of the world we live in. I love being a part of the dialogue, so there's some contact information. You can find it on the CD as well, so I love talking about this, so stay in touch. All right, so we're not talking about clicking scan. So how many of us, you do vulnerability assessment, you say, okay, I'm one of your tools guys, I do vulnerability assessment, and a lot of people might think, okay, you set up the scanner, you click scan, and that's it. That's all you do, right? Would you agree that it's a little more complex than that? I mean, hopefully it is. So it's regarded as one of the least sexy things in InfoSec, right? Our industry is really exciting right now and has been for a while, and there's a lot of interesting things going on. And so vulnerability assessment tends to get glossed over, I think. But it's my view that it's a key component of our information security program, and one that's often overlooked. And if you overlook it and you don't give it the attention it deserves, you're doing a disservice to your organization. So as I talk through this and talk about some of the success stories I have had, hopefully this will be useful to you when you go back to your organizations that you're supporting. We're going to talk about how we can go beyond the scan and provide tangible value, not only to the security team, but the entire business that we're supporting. Because at the end of the day, that's the point, right? Information assurance of whatever business we're doing this for. So whether you're a red team, or blue team, we're doing kind of the heavy lifting, blue-collar security work, I think, is what we're talking about. So this next slide, we talk with clients I've worked with, we talk a lot about the human scanner, the human tester and the tools-based scanning. And the scan data by itself is very, very useful, right? I mean, it tells you a lot about your environment and what you're doing. And the human testing is absolutely critical. Without the human testers, you're just gathering data and making a bunch of noise. But I really feel strongly that when you apply the human testers, it's all of us, to the data that we gathered, that's when actionable information happens. And I think that's the sweet spot when you apply the human to the scan data we gather, magical things start to happen. So I point that out just to reiterate the point that this isn't a tools-based talk. I'm advocating for using tools in a smart way, but more importantly, you gotta have people who know what they're doing when they use these tools. Does that make sense? I mean, have you ever, I'm sure you've experienced this too, but you've had cases where you say, oh, we need to do a scan, so we'll give it to, some new guy that works in desktop, and we'll give him the scanner and let him go run off and scan the network. I don't generally respond positively to that. Please don't do that. You need to have the talented humans that are doing it. So in addition to talking about, having the talented human and applying that to the data, a question that comes up a lot, and perhaps you've heard this question as well, what should we scan? And it's an important question because our organization might be very small or very large. I advocate for what I like to call longitudinal scans. Scan everything. Because clicking scan is easy, but making sense of the data is the hard part. And to realize some of the benefits I'm going to get to later on in this deck when I talk about the case studies, you have to do, again, longitudinal studies over time of a large number of hosts. Preferably, if it has an IP stack, you should scan it. Now, there may be different times where you're targeting scans and you're scanning very specific things that you're interested in, but at some point, to really understand your network environment, you need to see everything that's on there, not just the known quantities that you have. And there's some interesting stories coming up talking about that. So have your talented humans that are looking at the data and also scan all of the things. Another point I want to make, obviously we can't avoid talking about the tools because that's what we're using to gather this data, but I am going to try and be as vendor agnostic as possible. There's some names up here of some tools, and they're all very, very good in their own way. When you, on your current engagement or future engagements, you may have a situation where you need to pick a new tool, and that's very specific to the organization and what your goals are when you're doing it. There is one tool that I'm using currently that's doing very fine, but all of them will work, and you have to just make sure you're working with your organizations internally to decide which is the right one for you. So, all that having been said, before we start talking about scanning, I'm going to make you sit through a history lesson. So, when did all this start? When I was preparing the slide deck, I vaguely remembered when some of this started happening, but I did a little bit of research. The Security Administrator Tool for Analyzing Networks, or SATAN, was released in 1995. Now, obviously, the very talented folks that created it, but they weren't interested in marketing, obviously, with the name like Satan. I don't know that worked very well. And if was anybody around in the industry in 95, other than me, anybody were? Oh, thank goodness, my people. So that was a big deal when that happened. It absolutely polarized the industry. I remember reading in some of the trade rags and mailing lists that about half the folks thought this is the worst idea ever. Why in the world would you create a tool to make it easy to find vulnerabilities? The other half of the people thought, thank goodness, now I, as a systems administrator, have a way to find these vulnerabilities easily. And it was a very difficult conversation. A lot of people got very passionate about it, and it was the same type of discussion that we had years ago where firewalls were nothing more than an expensive way to slow down your network, and router ACLs will work just fine. We know that's not true, right? We should. So PC Mag in 1996 published an article, and just to give you a little context on what the state of the art was back then, what's that, 166 megahertz processors, 2 gig hard drives. And so it was a long time ago, right? Things were a lot different back then. So PC Mag wrote this article, and as you can see, the DOJ became very, very concerned about this tool and actually threatened to press charges against one of the authors of the tool. And I think they dropped the charges only after he lost his job. So to show you, for now, today, and 2015, when we do scans all the time, there's people out there that are literally scanning the internet. 20 years ago, this would get you landed in jail. That's just 2 decades. It's amazing to think that it was such a dramatic new thing that we were doing back then. One of the other tools that came out after Satan did, Internet Scanner, which later became ISS, can scan more than 100 known vulnerabilities. Think about that for a minute. I've got 100 known vulnerabilities on the computer in my pocket right now, probably, that many of you are trying to find, by the way. The scanner I'm using now, last time I checked it, it was scanning for something like 160,000 different specific vulnerabilities across multiple platforms. So in 20 years, we've gone from 100 known things that were primarily on Linux to now, almost a couple 100,000 on many different platforms. So you can learn more about these folks that were involved in creating Satan. They went on to have successful careers, and interestingly, a couple of folks got together and forked Satan into the Security Administrator's Integrated Network tool. They wisely chose Saint. So now this story is somewhat like a Dan Brown novel. Satan and Saint, yeah, thank you. I wrote that joke myself. And it became a commercial product in 1998. So, Satan came out in 95, all hell broke loose. 98 now, all of a sudden we've got commercial products, and obviously you remember from my earlier slide, there's lots of commercial products that exist. So from those humble beginnings, we've got now an entirely new capability that we didn't have before in InfoSec. It was very difficult to figure out what is wrong with our systems. So it progressed from simple scanning, 100 known vulnerabilities, to now we're doing vulnerability assessment. We're looking across multiple platforms, across a large number of hosts, and that leads into vulnerability management. I'm going to pause on this just for a moment to make the point that it's not just performing the scan. I distinguish vulnerability assessment from vulnerability management, because vulnerability management includes the things like, okay, now that we have this information and we know this, what are we going to do about it? And that's the whole risk management thing. You mitigate it, you accept it, or you transfer it, right? You got to do something now that we know this. And then now that we've decided what to do about it, how are we going to document it in an audible way? So we did this thing. How do we know that we did this thing and that it's actually working? And then now that we've documented it, how do we know that this decision that we made today continues to be the correct decision moving on in the future? Maybe there's a vulnerability that I know about, but I don't care because the threat landscape seems to be very, very tiny, but that can change. All of a sudden, a new 0 day comes out targeting whatever that vulnerability was. Now I care all of a sudden. So vulnerability management includes all of those things, from now that I know about it, what am I going to do? Now that I've done it, how do I document it and make sure that that continues to be the right decision? So already, what I'm telling you is once the scan is complete, there is a lot of work that goes on organizationally for us to make sure that we're actually protecting our information assets. So I went through all that just to say, and this is, either you already know this because you're doing it now, and so hopefully it's reinforcing this for you, so when you go back to work, it'll help out. Or if you're relatively new to this type of activity, hopefully you're starting to see that, oh man, after the scan is over, you're not done at all. So a couple of decades, excuse me, that was loud. A couple decades ago, scanners came out, and yet I still feel like in our industry, particularly where we start touching the business, they're still understood. I love that cartoon. No one else likes it? No laughs? Thank you. All right. They're still misunderstood. So in working with clients, several clients over the last several years, I eventually started, one question that always comes up is, okay, I've got human testing that's going on, so people are doing things and trying to break into things, and I'm doing tools-based scanning, so if I get this new scanner, what can I get rid of? And that was a terrifying conversation that I started to have, so I actually started talking about the scanning activity relative to the OSI model, and what this is going to show is what certain tools that we might use, how they work relative to other tools. So are we all familiar with the OSI model? Love it, hate it? There's lots of models to choose from. This just happened to be the one that worked the best. So down at the bottom, we've got physical. We're talking about electrons and photons going through fiber. If we're interested in things like TCP, UDP, IP ports, maybe we use something like Nmap to gather that information. If we're interested in, thick client applications that are talking to a server somewhere, now we're higher up in the model in the host layers. It's giving us visibility into there. User-facing web applications, maybe we use Web Inspect or Burp, and it's again, oops, I forgot to. There you go. Up high in the host layers, and again down on the network if we're wanting to sniff traffic. And it goes on. So you can see already when I drop the scanner in there, it's giving us a little bit wider view than some of those other tools are. So if the question ever comes up, okay, we bought this great expensive scanner, what can we get rid of? The answer is nothing, because this isn't replacing something. This is giving us additional information that's useful, and it kind of serves as an adjunct to the other information we're gathering. And of course, the only thing which is capable of scanning the entire stack is the humans, us. They're actually doing the work, and whether it's manually penetration testing on an application or manually trying to break in, or if it's just looking at the results of a tools-based scan that we gathered, the people are the most important thing. And I've gotten a lot of really good feedback, and I would be interested to hearing from you folks if this particular OSI slide is useful, because when again going to layer 8, leaving the technical and going to the starting to talk to the business, this really helps them see that we've got a lot of information we're dealing with when we talk about securing applications or systems, and there's lots of different ways we have to gather that information. So just to kind of illustrate that in a different way, so you can see our tools are very, very useful for those longitudinal scans that I talked about, doing scans over time of a large number of hosts, and comparing results so we can see, okay, what was our security posture today, and as that changes, it moves on, and statistical reporting. But the people, don't ever let anyone tell you if you decide to start using tools, which is a great idea, it's not going to replace other tools, it's also not going to replace your people. You still have to have people who know what that data is and what they're looking at. And you can read through the list of things that are on there. It's just a very short list of the things that we're good at that the tools are not. So they're critical, but limited without the skilled security professionals. All right, this is an interesting example of that. I told this story earlier today, and it worked out. So we did an assessment for a client, and we came back with a lot of HTTP-based vulnerabilities, a lot of Apache things. And we went to the ops team and said, hey, can you update Apache, please? It seems to be broke. And they came back and said, well, those aren't web servers, so obviously those are false positives. And we said, okay, well, yes, that server's job is not to be a web server, but I can see the banner right here. I assure you that there's a web daemon somewhere running on that thing. And as it turns out, it was a web-based management tool from the OEM that was sitting there helping gather data. And so even though it wasn't a web server in that's not what his primary job was, there still was, in fact, a web daemon running on that server. And it wasn't until, and apparently that had been reported previously, but it had gone unfixed because there wasn't that human analyst that was able to say, well, no, it's not a false positive, and here is why. That was a fun conversation to have. So one other thing, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but when you start having those conversations, when you're sharing results with operations or with business units or other people, I found a really interesting thing that when you use words, the same word might mean something completely different depending on who you're talking to. So use interface as an example. If I say interface 3 times, it's going to mean 3 different things depending on who I'm talking to, right? Have y'all ever had this experience as well? You know, if you're talking to, programmers, you say interface, there might be think REST API, right? It's an API that's allowing things. You talk to, routing and switching guys, and they're talking about, a network interface card that attaches a computer to a network. So it's important to be cognizant of who you're talking to when you're delivering these results or you're working on remediation efforts, because language can be a confusing thing. So you have to know what you're talking about. You need to know your environment as well. On a client engagement, we were trying to decide how to scan a very large network that had a global presence. So we had distributed scan engines that existed in various key locations around the world. And there's a location in southeast Texas. There was one in Brazil, one in Argentina. So intuitively, it seemed like, well, to scan South America, we should send a scan engine down to South America, right? When we met with the networking folks, what we realized is that both Brazil and Argentina backhauled through Houston. So if I wanted to scan Argentina from Brazil, it went by way of Houston first. So architecturally, the smart decision to do was to scan South America from North America. So it's not enough just to say, okay, we'll put a scanner out there somewhere and click scan and go nuts. If you have a sufficiently large and complex environment, you really need to know how those packets are getting to where they're headed to. So understand the architecture of your network logically and physically. So now we know what language to use. Now we know our environment. Now we need to know our organization. Okay, don't panic. I'm not going to walk you through this whole slide. I know there's a lot of boxes and a lot of things going on. But what it illustrates is working with a particular client. There's lots of ways a scanner can allow us to slice and dice data, right? Now, we've all done this. We can do different types of reports. We can look at specific vulnerabilities and hosts and group them in many different ways. But to get to that actionable and meaningful data that we're giving to the organization, we have to make very conscious decisions on how we're going to organize the data and how it relates to the support organizations that ultimately are going to fix the problems we identify. Can we get a little feedback? If you happen to be the same person that's identifying the problems and then also fixing them, then that might be a slightly different story. But in a lot of shops, you're reporting out information and you're working on helping validate findings and remediation efforts. But just the point of this is to spend a lot of time understanding how the data is going to relate to the different parts of the organization that you're going to talk to. And I really think that's a critical thing. All right, so now I'm going to get into the case studies, the very specific stories I have where we did some things that went beyond the scan that were a little unexpected, if not intuitive. So the list here, some of it's very obvious. Identifies potential vulnerabilities. Well, yes, of course. That's why we're doing this in the first place, right? But there's a lot of other things that a good scanner will do for us. Numbers 3 and 4 are not really specifically named capabilities, but if you're doing it right, asset management and software management will happen almost by accident. So you need to capitalize on that in your organization and don't focus solely on, well, I'm telling you what's wrong with your box, but all these other things as well. So let's get right into the case study part of it. Identifies potential vulnerabilities. So what we're trying to figure out here, and if you're already doing this, this might be a little obvious, but I think it's important to reiterate it, so bear with me. We want to figure out what are attractive targets, what patches are missing from those targets, but also, is our environment configured properly? So it's not just about the specific host, but the entire enterprise as a whole. So for example, we did a perimeter scan of an organization and found that CIFS was exposed to the open internet. And we panicked. I mean, these were NetBIOS ports on Windows boxes, many of which were Windows XP, and this was in 2013. And what happened is we asked the question, why? Why is that set up that way? That is the worst thing you could ever do, is to put those Windows boxes on the internet in that way. And the answer we got back is that it was necessary for support. And by the way, it's never a good idea to put a Windows box exposed with NetBIOS ports on the open internet. You're asking for trouble. But the support organization at this company they believed that that was the best way to do what they were trying to do. And so they opened up those ports. And of course, there's VPNs, there's remote access, there's a million billion better ways to do this thing. But because we asked the question why, rather than just saying, hey, close those ports and have a nice day, we realized that there was a gap in the understanding of how those boxes should even be supported in the first place. There was also a related issue where those boxes needed access to a legacy application that required IP-based authentication. So they needed to have unique IP addresses, and that's how this remote application would let them in. So they not only were those ports exposed, but they had static NATs set up so that each of these machines had a routable IP address. And so when they set up the NATing, which by itself isn't necessarily a huge deal, but for some reason they put an inbound firewall rule that was pretty much any except. So everything was coming inbound to these boxes. So what was interesting about that is we identified not only some technical problems, but also a business problem that was broken because they never should have allowed that firewall rule to be put in place as it was, right? So it's not, again, just about finding a vulnerability, but we found these processes that weren't working the way they should. Oops, I got ahead of myself. My apologies. So yeah, there were multiple misunderstandings that resulted in poor decisions. The poor decisions were left unchecked for a very, very long time. Then you get into, oh, well, Bob set that up, 10 years ago and he's retired and no one can call him to ask him why, and we're afraid to change it because something might stop working, so we're going to leave it alone. So we found not only those vulnerabilities, but there was poor documentation. We couldn't figure out why this thing was set up the way it was. Again, the broken processes that allowed the firewall rule to get put in place in the first place, and a lack of understanding of what the specific requirements were. At this same organization, we found that there is an obsolete version of Java that resulted in hundreds of findings. So if you do scanning, having obsolete Java shouldn't be a surprise, and having it result in hundreds of specific vulnerabilities shouldn't be a surprise either. But when we went back, and again, same question, why is this set up the way it is? The team came back and said, well, we have a business-critical application that requires that version of Java. Seemed like a sketchy answer. We didn't like it. So we actually called the vendor, which apparently no one had ever done before, and we said, hey, do you really require this specific version of Java? And they said, no, we require at least that version of Java. But apparently that wasn't, it's a very subtle detail that was left out at this client site, and so we went back and said, okay, you can't no longer hide behind the idea that, well, we have to use this version because the vendor said to. If I were a cynical person, and for those of you that know me, I kind of am, really, I think they were just using that as an excuse to not do the work of upgrading Java in a large enterprise. So you can help them understand the importance of what they're doing. So very similar results. There was poor documentation, there was broken processes, failures of the oral tradition where, well, I heard somebody say that that's the one that was required, so it must be true. All of these things were benefits that the organization got long after the scan was over. And it happened when we started working with the business units and the support organizations to figure these things out. So it'll provide, a scanning tool will provide remediation information. This is another one of those things that might be obvious to a lot of us in here, but I've worked with a lot of clients who are surprised to find out that not only will it tell me what's wrong with the systems I'm scanning, but a good commercial product will also tell us how we can fix it. And I think this client that I'm thinking of perhaps had only ever seen the results of a scan in a spreadsheet, right, that says IP address, host name, what's wrong with it. And when we provided a more detailed report that included the remediation information, it became hugely more valuable to this organization because now they knew not only what was wrong, but also what they needed to do to fix it. So make sure you capitalize. I mean, how many times has that happened to you? It's like, okay, there's this weird problem, operations, please go fix this thing. And it's impossible for any of us to know everything, so they might not know. So make sure you take advantage of the information that's already in the tool that you're using. Another cartoon. So asset management. Is anybody involved in asset management as well for your organizations here? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about here with herding cats. I mean, that's very difficult. If you're, I have a pretty good idea of what everything is on my home network, but in a big organization, if anyone tells you that, oh yeah, we know exactly what is on our wire everywhere across the organization, that might not be true. So here's where you have to make a decision, and I talked about in my opening remarks, that are you going to scan a specific list of hosts that you're interested in, or are you going to scan all the things and try and figure out what's out there? Now, those are two different activities that are solving two different problems, but I think we should do them both. A client I worked with scanned all of the CIDR blocks that they knew about, and we actually had a little bit of time left over in the engagement, so towards the end we decided, okay, well, let's scan the stuff that you think doesn't exist. Let's scan it anyway. And lo and behold, we found active networks that were completely undocumented. Now, obviously, the switches didn't turn themselves on, right, and hosts didn't come online on their own. Somebody had set up those networks, but it wasn't documented. They were forgotten about somehow. But by doing that activity, we can find parts of our networks that we maybe didn't even know what was there. So in addition to scanning known hosts, also it's a good idea to scan the CIDR blocks, the big ranges of IP addresses that exist on your network, to try and figure out what's there. One client that I'm working with, when you do that, and you scan these huge blocks, you end up creating a very, very nice inventory of what exists on your network. And if you have people that do configuration management in addition to asset management, it became very useful to share that information with them, because now there's a check and balance to validate the data that they have. So it's not even at that point a security-related issue at all, as much as it is asset management, but still hugely important. If you don't know what is on your network, how can you possibly secure it, right? An interesting thing happened at a previous client where we found a large number of IP cameras. So these cameras weren't on anybody's list. It was a little embedded system. It wasn't even a computer as such that anyone cared about, but they were all over this place, and many of them were configured incorrectly with default credentials. Right? I mean, how many times have we seen default credentials be a problem? But even though IT didn't care because they were a different organization supported by physical security, it was a huge win for the client because they fixed a very big problem that could have been a very big problem. The same client, it wasn't a security-related issue, but we found some Nintendo machines on the network. Now, it was a children's hospital, so it was okay. I mean, they were supposed to be there so the kids could play the games, but it illustrated the point that if IT didn't know they were there, now you have to ask the question, wait a minute, I've got gaming consoles that are on the same network as some of my production equipment. Is that really the best place to put that? So that starts driving the conversations of, how is our network configured? Are we doing this in an appropriate way and the best way we can? Last example for asset management was a drilling company I worked with. They had a lot of rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, and the way they couched it for us was that, okay, every platform has exactly 4 hosts on it, and that's all you're going to find. Okay, cool. So we do the scan, go over the VSAT connection, and we scan, and most of the platforms did, in fact, have exactly 4 hosts, and it was fine. But there was a couple that had way more than that, and we went back to the client and said, look, there's a dozen hot IP addresses coming off of this rig, and you obviously don't know what they are because you told me there were supposed to be 4. So they got really interested in that and trying to figure out what were those machines that were out there. There was obviously folks flying out to the location and bringing unauthorized devices. So asset management, I can't emphasize enough that in addition to finding what's wrong with the things that's on our network, finding out what is on our network in the first place is a huge idea. And I got permission from a gentleman I work with that, if you don't believe me, well, he said this on Twitter, so it must be true, right? Running an InfoSec program is 90% asset management. If you're not doing it, you're screwed no matter at what else you're doing. And I think that's very, very true, and I think it speaks to the importance of this activity and why we should spend a lot of time making sure we're hitting every corner of our network we get to. So similarly, with software management, do you know what software is running on every single machine in your enterprise that you're scanning? We might have a pretty good idea, but a good scanner that's doing credentialed scans, and by the way, that's a whole other part of the discussion. Do we scan with or without credentials? Obviously, you're going to get a lot more information if you provide credentials, and if you do, the good scanning tool will allow us to enumerate everything that's installed on a box, and that way, once we've done those scans, we can always go back and run reports and try and figure out if there's anything interesting there that we should that you would know about. Maybe you've standardized on Internet Explorer for your browser. Sorry if you did. And maybe you don't want Firefox for some reason. Or what about BitTorrent clients or Kazaa? If you found those on your network, you'd be very interested in knowing about that. So don't forget that having a list of that software that's running is hugely, hugely important. So compliance. On some level, we're scanning things and we're flinging packets, information comes back, and we make decisions about what the configuration is, and we can learn more about activities we need to take to make them more secure. But make sure your scanner, if compliance is an issue for you, is compliance an issue for anyone, by the way? Cool, yeah, a few hands. So if it's a standard like PCI, or if it's a regulation like HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, GLBA, your scanner should be able to tell you what your security posture looks like relative to something else. And that can be important if you do work with audit folks or, again, with compliance folks. Make sure you're taking advantage of the fact that you can gather that information and help you understand what your compliance status is. That's all I'm going to say about that. So strategically, the information we're gathering should be very important to our organizations as well. And I'm talking about ongoing operational intelligence. So again, I'll use the word again because I like it. I'm talking about these longitudinal scans that we do over time. We're scanning large numbers of hosts as often as possible. So it's not a scan at a point in time. We're looking at the trends that are developing as we continue to do these scans. And that can become very strategic and important in an unexpected way, and that is, if you look and you see that you're continuing to find vulnerabilities but they're not getting fixed, maybe you have a resourcing problem. And I've actually seen where managers were able to say, wait a minute, we're not fixing things quickly enough or efficiently enough, so that can be data that you can use to help find out if you have staffing problems or even process problems with your organization. So strategically, it can be very, very important. Tactically, it can be very, very, very important as well. So if we're doing these scans often and over time, if something happens like heartbleed happens, well, I don't necessarily have to perform a new scan right now just to figure out if heartbleed is going to be an issue for me, I've already scanned these systems, so I should know what versions of SSL exist and whether or not I care about these things, what platforms they're running on, and those sorts of questions. Or if something happens and now all of a sudden Bash is vulnerable, we don't need to perform a new scan straight away. We should already know if this is in our environment and if we need to do something. So not only is it strategically very, very important, but tactically it can be very, very important as well. So does anybody work in either healthcare or work on environments that have industrial control systems? More hands. All right, so this conversation is going on a lot in our industry now, and it's going to continue because these systems in particular are not the same as the other computers that are on our networks, right? Biomedical devices and control systems, SCADA, and things that help run, plants and refineries and whatnot, they're highly, highly specialized. And they're purpose-built, and they're used to getting a very, very specific type of traffic. So when you start throwing unexpected traffic at them as you're trying to scan it and figure out what's on there, weird things can happen. And that's both true for biomedical and ICS. So if you work in a healthcare organization and there's biomed, you need to be careful. So my first bullet point there, FDA 510K, that's kind of a hot button for me because although the FDA is getting a little stronger in forcing equipment manufacturers to do it in a more secure way, a lot of times you'll find that your manufacturer will hide behind the FDA regulation. And by the way, if you want to hear more about FDA, there's a link there. I blogged about it, and there's some good information, I think. Does anyone know specifically what FDA 510K is and have to deal with it now? Maybe not? Okay, I'll say. So FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, says that before you sell a medical device, you have to go through pre-market submission. That is to say, they have to examine it and make sure that it's not going to harm the patient. Once the FDA says, yes, this device is fine, you can use it, you can't make any changes to it. That becomes a problem when I say you need to patch your X-ray machine, because they tend to say, well, no, we can't change it because pre-market submission says we can't change it. So be aware of that if you're in charge of finding vulnerabilities in your organization. You have to work very closely with your biomedical team. The guidance that's come out from the FDA in the past years, they're really strengthening their position and saying, look, applying a patch to an X-ray machine that happens to run a Windows operating system, that's fine. Please do that. In fact, not patching it causes greater risk to the patient than patching the device and potentially changing it. It's the security versus supportability issue, and it's not by any means unique to healthcare. But it's a problem we have to deal with all the time. And sometimes that can lead to poor design decisions. For example, we did a scan of some radiology devices, and it was a large number of workstations that were in this hospital. The vendor supported the software that was on it, and they supported it with FTP. So every one of these workstations had IIS installed, and it was running FTP. But to make it easy to support, they set it up so anonymous logins were enabled, and to make sure that they had access to the file system, they moved the FTP root all the way up to the root of the system drive. So in effect, and I'm not making this up, I know this, I mean, who in the world would ever do that? Buy me a beer and I'll tell you later who did that. But basically everybody that had access to the network had anonymous FTP access to the entire file system, and the service account, by the way, that was used to do this had local administrative access. So, I mean, it's the worst thing you could possibly ever do. And so normally if you scan and you see FTP, that might not be a big deal, but again, asking those questions why, it became a big deal very, very quickly. So similar set of stories with industrial control systems. If any of you work with that now, again, I'm talking about the control systems that maybe turn valves at refineries or chemical plants and those sorts of things. Operational technology, the OT, SCADA, those things, they're not the same as information technology at all. Shutting down a plant to do maintenance on computers is extremely expensive, and their patch cycles might be measured in months or years. So if you find yourself working on these types of systems, you need to make sure that you work closely with the OT people to understand that once you find the vulnerability, remediation efforts aren't going to be as simple as applying a patch or making a change. And in fact, when you do scan it, it's the same with biomedical. They're purpose-built, very, very specific, and if they get unusual traffic, they might not deal with it very well at all. So be very cautious in those environments. I know I'm running out of time, so I'd be glad to talk about this more later if you want, but basically, the story I've tried to tell you is that scanning's been around for a long time. It's matured to something that's a lot more useful to our organizations than it was 10 years ago. And don't think of the data that's in your scanner as being data that's in a bucket. It's useful information that become powerful when shared appropriately. So look for opportunities to share this data within your organization. And if you develop a mature vulnerability management program that includes all these processes, I think you'll really impact your organization in a meaningful way. Thank you very much for sitting through all that, and enjoy DEF CON 23. Thank you.